Of all the enemies that the Republic battled over the millennia, none were more feared than the empires of the Sith. There were 5 Sith empires that challenged the Republic in the millennia before its fall, rising and falling one after the other over the course of 6,000 years. But each of these Sith empires was radically different from the last, both in terms of structure and in terms of how they operated. In this video, we're going to be exploring the differences between the different Sith empires and explaining why they existed at all.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We'll start at the beginning with the oldest and longest lasting of the Sith empires, which was founded 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin. This Sith empire came into being when the Sith purebloods, a brutal and strongly force-sensitive species, were conquered by those they called Jedi, 12 dark Jedi exiled from the Republic for crimes against civilization. The exiles infiltrated and seized control of Sith society, killing its existing rulers and declaring themselves to be gods, naming themselves the Lords of the Sith. These new Sith Lords reshaped the existing multi-planetary kingdom of the Sith into a proper Sith Empire, and they fused their own Dark Jedi teachings with those of the Sith, creating the ideology and techniques the Sith would become known for. Their empire would rule for nearly 2,000 years out in the depths of the Outer Rim, conquering many worlds in the regions far beyond the Republic's borders. The original Sith Lords were members of non-Sith species, but they interbred with the Sith purebloods and started long lineages of Sith half-breeds, which dominated Sith society alongside the purebloods after the exiles were all dead. A similar pattern played out with the society of the Sith Empire as a whole. Since the Dark Jedi were few in number, they chose to assimilate into Sith culture rather than try to make the Sith more Dark Jedi-like, only injecting a few key elements of themselves into the cultural fabric of the Sith Empire. As a result, the Sith Empire drew heavily on the pre-conquest civilization for its structure and cultural norms, which the Dark Jedi accepted and simply warped to their own ends. One of the most important aspects of this was the Sith caste system, which formed the basis of the Sith Empire's structure. The Sith had divided themselves into castes long ago, and a mix of dark side alchemical techniques and long millennia of strict delineation meant that these castes had actually diverged into different subspecies by the time the Gen Jedi showed up. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the Grotu, the slaves, which were the largest caste in the Sith Empire. This caste had originally been composed of Sith that were considered lesser by the others, possibly for lack of force sensitivity, but in the time of the Sith Empire, the ranks of the Grotu had been swollen by beings of many species who had been taken as slaves in Sith raids. All non-Sith purebloods or half-breeds in the Sith Empire, apart from the Gen Jedi and a few other special exceptions, were considered inferior beings and became Grotu. Notable species in their ranks included the Mursai, Hergliks, and humans. The Grotu were the menial laborers of the Sith Empire, responsible for industrial production, menial labor, and all the other things the higher caste Sith considered to be beneath them. Grotu were treated with extraordinary cruelty by the higher castes, and they were often worked to death or used as living shields in battle. Ranked above the Grotu were the Massassi, the Sith warrior castes, who you might also know as the people who built the temples of Yavin 4. Massassi generally weren't very intelligent, but a mix of natural selection and alchemy shaped them into towers of claw and muscle over the millennia, making them some of the most terrifying opponents in the galaxy. They were incredibly strong and agile, and they were absolutely ferocious in battle, powered by berserker-like rage. They could get up to 3 meters in height, and they had tough skin, acute senses, and pupilless, pale yellow eyes, which gave them an uncanny appearance. Massassi were deployed en masse against the enemies of the Sith, and their masters generally relied on their strength, bloodlust, and the terror they inflicted to win the day. Armed with alchemically enhanced swords and razor-sharp Lanvarok throwing discs, the Massassi were the fist of the Sith Empire, feared by even the members of the Sith's higher castes and restricted only by their relative unintelligence. Above the Massassi were the Zuguruk, the Sith engineer caste. These guys were interesting as they not only formed a sort of middle class in Sith society, but they also kept to the background, coming up in sources far less than the other castes. The Zuguruk were more intelligent than the Massassi, but were still somewhat lacking in force sensitivity, and they put their intelligence to use in designing and overseeing the construction of the Sith Empire's war machines, starships, cities, and grand monuments. Due to their role in designing the great tombs, citadels, and warships of the Sith, the Zuguruk had a comfortable, privileged role, though they still ranked below the ruling castes of the Sith Empire. The original ruling caste was the Kisai, the priest caste, whose members were all strong in the dark side of the Force. The Kisai devoted their lives to intellectual pursuits, leadership, and the study of the Force, and they were largely responsible for shaping Sith society into what it was when the exiles showed up. The Kisai pioneered Sith alchemy and honed many dark side techniques, and it was their teachings that the Dark Jedi fused with their own to form Sith ideology. The Kisai also handled the indoctrination of the lower castes in the ways of the Sith. When the Dark Jedi conquered the Sith Empire, they set themselves up as the new ruling caste of the Sith Lords. This caste was a bit more fluid than the others, and it intermixed somewhat with the Kisai caste. During the Sith Empire, the structure of the ruling caste had developed to the point where Kisai who weren't involved in the Sith Order proper were at the bottom, while Kisai who were apprentices, acolytes, or assistants of the Sith Lords ranked above them, and the Lords themselves ranked at the top. At any given time, there were 12 Sith Lords, 2 of whom ranked above the others. One became the Shadow Hand, the second in command of the Sith Empire, while the other received the title of Gennari, becoming the Dark Lord of the Sith, the sole ruler of the Sith Empire. The other 10 sat on the Sith Council, working together to rule the Sith Empire. The Sith Empire was essentially a feudal state, its territories divided between the different Sith Lords, who ruled as petty kings under the purview of their overlord, the Dark Lord of the Sith. A few Sith worlds were neutral ground between the different Sith Lords, territories ruled directly by the Dark Lord and their Shadow Hand. These included the original Sith homeworld of Korriban, which under the Sith Empire was a barren and little inhabited graveyard planet, as well as the adopted Sith homeworld of Ziost, a frigid world that became the capital of the Sith Empire. The Dark Lord had his throne on Ziost, and the Sith Council met there regularly in a towering citadel. All the other worlds of the Sith were possessions of one of the 10 lesser Sith Lords, each of whom had their own capitals, armies, war fleets, and agendas. The Sith Lords were constantly at one another's throats, but they were all kept in check by the Dark Lord of the Sith. The different castes of the Sith did a pretty good job of illustrating the Sith Empire's priorities. The Sith Empire was a realm of the dark side, ruled by its most powerful adherents and those who advanced its study. Apart from the dark side, the Sith Empire primarily prioritized 2 things: conquest and the construction of grand monuments. The Sith Empire was expansionist, swelling from just a dozen worlds at the beginning to well over 120 star systems. The Sith Lords built vast armies of Massassi and war beasts, fleets of battleships and attack fighters, and a bloodthirsty, warmongering populace that was brainwashed into total loyalty. The Sith's expansion was only kept in check by the Stygian Caldera, a hard-to-penetrate ring of nebulae that kept the Sith mostly penned up within a small pocket of the Outer Rim. The Sith extracted slaves and resources from their many conquered worlds, and apart from the growing military might of the Sith Empire, these were used primarily for the self-aggrandizement of the Sith Lords. The Sith Empire's other grand pursuit was the building of enormous temples, monuments, and especially tombs dedicated to the Sith Lords. These vanity projects were only the most visible of the many ways in which the Sith Lords used their armies to enrich themselves, accruing ever greater treasure hoards and in the process, ever greater power. This was something the Sith Lords of future generations would do as well, but the original Sith Lords were second to none at it. All told, the old Sith Empire was a vast and powerful monument to the dark side, a grandiose, incredibly wealthy, and incredibly stratified society that reveled in its own power. It was run according to the teachings of the dark side, and its rulers quite openly cared for nothing but ever greater power for themselves. All below them were utterly subjugated, crushed by the ruthless Sith caste system, and brainwashed into wholeheartedly believing in the ways of the Sith. And yet, the Sith Empire was also, fundamentally, a civilization of the Sith purebloods. It retained the trappings, the caste structure, feudal nature, and the general society of the old kingdom of the Sith, just with the Sith Lord's own systems grafted onto it. In that respect, it was a fascinating composite civilization, one that would vanish all but entirely after the Sith Empire's fall. Part of that was because the original Sith Empire's structure had self-destructive tendencies baked into it. The constant competition between the different Sith Lords was a threat to the Empire's stability, and that was ultimately what brought about the Sith Empire's destruction. After a failed invasion of the Republic in the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, the remaining military forces of the Sith Empire destroyed themselves in a petty squabble between Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh, and as a result, the Republic had an easy time staging a counter-invasion and crushing the Sith Empire once and for all. As it did so, the remaining Sith Lords ordered their subjects to fight to the death and to commit mass suicide rather than surrender to Republic forces. And as a result, Sith civilization as a whole was completely destroyed. 1,000 years later, however, a new Sith Empire emerged, built from the fragments of the first and a scattered collection of allies. This was the short-lived Sith Empire ruled by Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma, which challenged the Republic in the Great Sith War. The Sith Empire was more of an alliance between different loosely related factions than a true empire, and it maintained very little territory of its own. Part of the old Sith Empire lived on in Exar Kun's new one. Kun commanded an army of Massassi that had followed Naga Sadow into exile on Yavin 4, and he and Ulic Qel-Droma, the rulers of the Empire, claimed the titles of Dark Lord of the Sith and Shadowhand. But virtually nothing else about Kun's Sith Empire was the same. Apart from the Massassi, who were few in number and usually only saw deployment off Yavin 4 as Exar Kun's bodyguard, most of the members of this new Sith Empire were not Sith. The Empire was formed from an alliance between Kun's Massassi, the Mekrosa Order, the Mandalorian Crusaders, and the Krath, which was a Sith-inspired cult run by Ulic Qel-Droma and Alima Keto. All of those other groups had their own hierarchies, ideologies, and practices, which they retained when fighting under the Sith banner. The Krath were Sith-inspired and partly run directly by one of the Sith Lords, but they were mostly just a new religious framework grafted onto existing Tetan society. The Mekrosa Order was an organization of Darksiders, but they were non-Sith and mostly just allies of the Empire, ruled by their own High Lady, Brezwalt III. The Mandalorian Crusaders had nothing to do with the dark side, and their leader, Mandalore the Indomitable, had just sworn an oath of loyalty to Exar Kun. Alongside these disparate groups, Exar Kun formed a sect of Dark Jedi known as the Brotherhood of the Sith, who he recruited from among the younger and more ambitious Jedi. These fallen Jedi waged a bloody civil war within the Jedi Order and became the generals of the Sith Empire's army, though none of them were truly considered to be Sith Lords, as that title was reserved only for Kun and Qel-Droma. All told, Exar Kun's Sith Empire was a very diverse and largely non-Sith organization. Hell, it wasn't even truly an empire either, as it never set out to conquer territory, instead waging war to simply destabilize and destroy the Republic and Jedi Order. It ultimately existed for less than a year, all told. Toward the end of 3996 BBY, the same year the Great Sith War had started, Ulic Qel-Droma rejected the Sith ways and was captured by the Jedi. The Mandalorian Crusaders were defeated in the skies above Onderon, and both the Krath fleet and most of Exar Kun's Dark Jedi were largely wiped out by the Republic Navy. Shortly thereafter, the Republic staged a full-scale attack on Yavin 4, in which the Massassi were wiped out and Exar Kun was believed destroyed. His Sith Empire ceased to exist, and shortly thereafter, the Macrosa Order and what was left of the Krath were utterly destroyed by the Republic. Only a few scattered Sith remnants, a mix of former Brotherhood of the Sith members and Krath soldiers, were able to escape to Korriban, where they founded the colony of Dreshte and waited for the Sith to rise again. They didn't have to wait very long. Just 40 years after the defeat of Exar Kun in 3959 BBY, a new Sith Empire arose, one that would conquer more territory than any before it. This was Darth Revan's Sith Empire, a short-lived but fearsome military power that fought the Republic after the Jedi Civil War. This Sith Empire emerged after the end of the Mandalorian Wars, in which a band of Jedi Crusaders, led by Revan and Malak, saved the Republic from Mandalorian invasion, but fell to the dark side in the process. After the Mandalorian Wars' end, they turned on the Republic, declaring themselves the new Dark Lords of the Sith and turning their army into the foundation of a new Sith Empire. Revan's Sith Empire was greatly unlike the original, and it was unlike Exar Kun's as well. The only elements of the original Sith Empire that it retained were that it was an expansionist empire ruled by a Dark Lord of the Sith and his Shadow Hand, to whom answered a number of lesser Sith Lords, Sith Acolytes, and Apprentices, and Dark Jedi. The rest of Revan's Sith Empire was completely different, in large part because it had evolved out of the Republic. The earlier Sith Empires had evolved out of the civilization of Sith purebloods, but there were none of those in Revan's Empire, and Revan's Sith Empire didn't adopt any elements of their culture. This new Sith Empire simply adopted the ideology of the Sith Order, which it used to warp the culture and society of the Republic to its own ends. This empire was a corrupted remnant of the Republic rather than an alien existential threat to it. This was evident from the Sith Empire's composition alone. Its military was composed of Republic military defectors, and most of the Sith Empire's territory was former Republic space. Even its Sith Lords had once been heroes of the Republic, something that compelled many people who had lost faith in the Republic and the Jedi to join this new Sith threat. Many Jedi sided with Revan instead of the Council, and many in the Republic military switched sides, including some of the Navy's top officers such as General Derrid, Mon Halan, and most significantly, Admiral Karath. And as the leaders of the Republic military jumped ship, vast numbers of their subordinates followed suit, trading in their black and orange Republic jumpsuits for sleek chrome Sith Trooper armor. Over the course of the Jedi Civil War, the Sith Empire conquered a third of Republic space, and its expansion was facilitated by its familiarity. Many sectors joined the Sith willingly, and many people were able to downplay the evils of the Sith to themselves because of their familiarity. Darth Revan deliberately engineered the Sith Empire's structure to maintain this familiarity, as opposed to Exar Kun, who distanced himself from Republic civilization and encouraged his followers to do the same. There were outside influences in Revan's empire though. The Starforge, the secret driving force behind the Sith's enormous armada, was of Rakatan origin, and Revan's Sith Empire also absorbed the remnants of Exar Kun's Sith Empire. But for the most part, the society of this Sith Empire was essentially just a more militarized version of Republic society. Revan even kept a lot of old local government structures intact in conquered sectors, facilitating the expansion of the Sith Empire and reducing strain on its resources. Rather than redoing everything from the ground up, his Sith simply grafted a new military hierarchy on top of old structures and institutions. Conquered planets mostly kept their old governments, but with new Sith governors as overseers. These governors were typically Dark Jedi and commanded a garrison of Sith troopers, which ensured that the Sith got their way on the planet and that the government did what the Sith Empire wanted it to. Nonetheless, this usually just amounted to a greater push for militarization and the centralization of a planet's industry, and as a result, very little actually changed on most planets the Sith conquered, reinforcing the impression that the Sith really weren't much different from the Republic. Nonetheless, this system achieved the main objectives the Sith Empire had in conquering planets, which were to establish a massive, powerful galactic military-industrial complex and to use it to build a standing army. So long as those objectives were being pursued by the many systems in the Empire, the Sith Empire's leadership only really focused on its military forces. Indeed, the Sith Empire had very little in the way of federal-level civilian government. The local civilian governments just answered to the military. Even then, there wasn't much central government infrastructure. The public capital of the Sith Empire wasn't Korriban, but all that was there was the Sith Academy and the small, largely Zerka Corporation-run Dreshte colony. The Sith Empire's true capital was the Starforge and the nearby planet Rakata Prime, but these were kept a closely guarded secret even among Sith leadership. In practice, Sith leadership was mobile, operating from the flagships of the Sith Armada. The military forces of the Sith Empire were vast and highly efficient, a well-ordered military machine that put the forces of the older Sith Empires to shame. The core of this military machine was the Sith Armada, a vast navy supported by a fast-acting starfighter corps, but the Sith naturally maintained ground armies as well. The Sith military didn't seem to have distinct branches. Ground forces and fighter wings were usually attached to the warships they traveled aboard, with the only known exceptions being the garrisons assigned to support planetary governors. As a result, the Sith military all operated under one broad military hierarchy, which operated with three main tiers. The bottom tier consisted of the Sith Empire's many war droids, which answered to organic controllers and were automatically outranked by all organic Sith personnel, with the possible exception of Darth Revan's personal assassin droid, HK-47. Most Sith war droids that weren't assassins had very rudimentary logic modules, and as such, they were seen as tools rather than personnel by their superiors, churned out in vast numbers by the Starforge and often deployed as cannon fodder. The middle tier of the Sith military consisted of all non-force sensitive organic personnel. These were mostly Republic defectors, and they seem to have followed a vaguely similar hierarchy to the Republic military. At the bottom of the hierarchy were conscripts and enlisted Sith ground soldiers, which appear to have mostly been used as reserve forces, as well as the crews of Sith warships. Above them were the Sith's starfighter pilots and the Sith troopers, an elite class of soldier analogous to the later Imperial stormtroopers. These chrome-armored warriors had better training and equipment than most Sith personnel, and they were much tougher than their rank-and-file inferiors. Sith troopers served as marines aboard Sith capital ships, deployed as guards or to board enemy vessels, and in ground battles, they formed the vanguard of the Sith army. Above the Sith troopers was the Sith Empire's officer class, which included a number of ranks, including lieutenant, captain, commander, general, and admiral. The most high-ranking non-force sensitive in the Sith Empire was the commander of the Sith Armada, a rank that was first held by Admiral Karath and then by Admiral Varko, suggesting that it went to the highest-ranking naval officer in the Sith Empire. The military hierarchy of the Sith Empire was strict, yet there was a surprising amount of social mobility within it, especially when compared to the caste system of the original Sith Empire. Sith personnel were encouraged to be ambitious and to compete with one another for higher ranks, even if it meant eliminating their superiors to take their place. This, of course, was a fundamental part of Sith philosophy, but unlike previous Sith empires, Darth Revan encouraged it even among his non-force sensitive followers, believing that it allowed the strongest and most capable to rise to the top. The third and highest tier of the Sith military hierarchy, of course, consisted of the many force sensitives that served the Sith Empire. All of these beings were adherents of the dark side, but not all of them were truly Sith, and there was a complex ranking system in place among them. The largest population of Force users in the Sith Empire were Dark Jedi, Jedi who had fallen to the dark side and sworn loyalty to the Sith, but who hadn't technically become part of the Sith Order. Most of these Dark Jedi were treated essentially as soldiers with different capabilities, and they came in 3 known ranks: Dark Jedi Apprentices, Full-fledged Dark Jedi, and Dark Jedi Masters. The Dark Jedi Masters had positions of high authority within the Sith Empire and were often assigned key commands, while the lesser Dark Jedi had much less standing. Some of the highest ranked non-Force sensitive Sith officers actually outranked the Dark Jedi, such as Admiral Karath. The true Sith in Revan's empire were trained at the Sith Academy on Korriban. Many of these started as Dark Jedi before setting out to learn the ways of the Sith, becoming Sith apprentices and later Sith acolytes or Sith marauders. Others became Sith assassins, a special class of Sith that Revan deployed on covert Jedi hunting missions. The greatest of these different Sith became Sith Lords, the rulers of the Empire. The Sith Lords outranked all others, and they were fairly few in number, assigned only to the most important tasks, such as running the Sith Academy. Of these Sith Lords, 2 outranked all the rest: the Dark Lord of the Sith and their Shadow Hand. These roles were originally held by Darth Revan and Darth Malak, respectively, before Malak seized the title of Dark Lord and took first Darth Bandon and then Basta Lashan as his Shadow Hands. These 2 were the absolute rulers of the Sith Empire, the ones who dictated everything the Sith Armada did. This structure was highly efficient, but it had a key weakness. If enough of its leaders were eliminated all at once, the whole thing would come apart at the seams. That's exactly what happened after the Battle of Rakata Prime, which, in one fell swoop, saw the elimination of the Dark Lord of the Sith, their Shadow Hand, the commander of the Sith Armada, and all of the top Sith and officers in line to replace them. With the chain of command obliterated, all of the surviving Sith acolytes and officers turned on each other, destroying what was left of the Sith Empire in a brutal struggle for power. This Sith civil war was brief, lasting only a few months, but by the time it was over, the Sith Empire had ceased to exist, and the Sith were reduced to scattered remnants in the depths of the Outer Rim. Just a few centuries later, however, yet another Sith Empire challenged the Republic. This empire was actually a splinter of the original Sith Empire, and it had been waiting in the unknown regions since the Great Hyperspace War for its chance to exact revenge against the Republic. This true Sith Empire, unlike the Sith Empires forged by Revan and Exar Kun, was directly descended from the original, yet it was much more similar to Revan's Sith Empire than any other. It had done away with the caste system of the original Sith Empire in favor of a more conventional military hierarchy, though vestiges of the ancient castes remained. The true Sith Empire was formed and led by Sith purebloods that had escaped the destruction of the original Sith Empire, but due to the massive losses their species had sustained, many high-ranking positions within the Sith Empire were filled by humans. Officially, the true Sith preached that Sith purebloods and humans were superior species, though many purebloods considered humans inferior as well, and their heightened status was treated mostly as a necessary evil. All other species in the Sith Empire were enslaved, condemned to work as menial laborers or personal servants, much like the ancient Grotu caste. For most of the true Sith Empire's history, slavery was legally heritable, passed from slaves down to all their offspring, but an exception was later implemented so that Force-sensitive slaves could be recruited to become Sith acolytes. The Sith Empire's slave class made up the majority of its industrial workforce. The true Sith Empire was very heavily militarized, and unlike all previous Sith Empires, its military hierarchy was mostly conventional, largely due to the influence of the human officer Odile Vaken, who might have been drawing on Republic military structures and tradition. The Sith Empire had 2 military branches, the Army and the Navy, both of which were vast in size. This was because the true Sith Empire conscripted all non-Force sensitive adults into military service, only letting them leave and live civilian lives when they were unable to serve any longer. The ground soldiers of the true Sith Empire were sometimes known as Sith Troopers, but unlike the Sith Troopers of Revan's Sith Empire, these weren't an elite class of soldier. Rather, they were just ordinary rank and files, and the true Sith lacked a true stormtrooper equivalent. Sith soldiers were heavily armed and armored, and the known army ranks were private, specialist, corporal, sergeant, ensign, lieutenant, captain, major, colonel, and general. The naval forces of the true Sith Empire had a separate but similar rank structure, with the known ranks being private, specialist, corporal, petty officer, ensign, lieutenant, captain, group captain, commodore, and admiral. Both branches of the military were overseen by Imperial High Command. Above the true Sith Empire's military hierarchy was a rather convoluted government bureaucracy, which was run by the Sith Lords themselves. The true Sith Empire was ruled by the Sith Emperor, a role that, for the vast majority of the Empire's history, was held by Darth Vitiate. However, Vitiate did very little of the actual work of running the true Sith Empire. He kept the old Sith Council around for that job. Under the true Sith Empire, the Sith Council became the Dark Council, a group of the 12 highest-ranking Sith Lords, all of whom answered to the Emperor alone, as well as his closest servants, the Emperor's hands. The Dark Council functioned similarly to the Sith Council, but with one key difference. Whereas members of the Sith Council had all been feudal lords, each running a part of the Sith Empire, the members of the Dark Council instead each ran a part of the Empire's bureaucracy, with the true Sith Empire being a unitary state ruled in its entirety by the Council and the Emperor together. Each member of the Dark Council oversaw a sphere of influence, each of which constituted a number of ministries and agencies. The sphere of technology, sphere of biotic science, and sphere of production and logistics oversaw the true Sith Empire's industrial capabilities. The spheres of military strategy, military offense, imperial intelligence, defense of the Empire, and expansion and diplomacy all oversaw the Empire's military and foreign policy. The spheres of mysteries and ancient knowledge oversaw Sithy stuff, and the sphere of law and justice oversaw the legal system. Within each sphere was a number of organizations and agencies, the most important of which were three ministries: the Ministry of Intelligence, the Ministry of Logistics, and the Ministry of War. The highest ranks of the true Sith Empire were dominated by members of the Sith Order, which, of course, had its own hierarchy. At the bottom were the Sith Acolytes, Force sensitives who were just beginning their training in the ways of the Sith. Acolytes studied at the Sith Academy on Korriban under an overseer, and if they proved themselves, they would become a full-fledged Sith apprentice to a Sith Lord. Apprentices would become Sith Lords in turn, and they usually chose specialty careers when they did so, usually becoming Sith Warriors or Sith Inquisitors, with some further specializing as Sith Marauders, Sith Juggernauts, Sith Assassins, or Sith Sorcerers. Unlike in the original Sith Empire, in which the rank of Sith Lord was restricted to the members of the Sith Council, in the true Sith Empire, Sith Lords were far more common, though they were held at a much lower standard. The greatest of the Sith Lords were afforded the ancient title of Darth, and the greatest of these would become members of the Dark Council. All 12 members of the Dark Council were given the rank of Dark Lord of the Sith, though they were really equivalent to the ordinary Sith Lords of the old Sith Empire. Above them, of course, was the Sith Emperor, the supreme Dark Lord of the Sith. There were also a whole slew of specialized ranks and suborders of Sith in the true Sith Empire, such as the Emperor's Wrath, all of which carried out specific missions, mostly at the behest of the Emperor. The structure of the true Sith Empire was more rigid and durable than those of the other Sith Empires of the old Sith Wars, though it was still prone to infighting. Nonetheless, it might have been the most stable Sith Empire were it not for Darth Vitiate, whose mad plans for galactic annihilation eventually turned his own followers against him. When a Republic strike team allegedly killed the Emperor, the Dark Council did nothing to help, instead choosing to continue ruling the Empire themselves. When Vitiate's galaxy-consuming plans were exposed, it was enough for the Sith to ally themselves with the Republic in an effort to stop him. Later on, they would appoint a new Sith Empress, Darth Asina, but from that point forward, the true Sith Empire became increasingly less stable and by around 3500 BBY, it had ceased to exist. That leaves us with the last of the Sith Empires, the new Sith Empire, established by Darth Ruin in 2000 BBY. This section will be short, since structure was a bit of an alien concept to the new Sith, some radical form of Jedi propaganda that they were too good for. The new Sith were never really an empire, though they always maintained the dream of becoming one. Rather, much like Exar Kun's Sith Empire, they were more of a collection of cults working toward a common purpose of destroying the Republic and the Jedi Order. They waged constant war against the Republic for 1,000 years, but despite this, they never had much in the way of central structure, and they were an empire only in a very abstract sense. Originally, many of the cults of the new Sith were under the loose command of Darth Ruin, the founder of the new Sith, who attempted to forge them all together into a new Sith Empire. But Ruin was slain by his apprentices early in the new Sith Wars, fracturing Ruin's empire into a jumbled mess of Sith kingdoms, which were at odds with each other as much as the Jedi. These Sith states were all small and largely insignificant, easy for the Republic to clear out on an individual basis. But there were so many of them that the Republic found it impossible to get rid of them all before new ones cropped up. The new Sith were like a hydra, and through centuries of warfare and steady pressure, they slowly strangled the Republic. By 1100 BBY, the new Sith were on the verge of galactic domination, but even with Coruscant itself at their mercy, their fragile coalition fell apart as the Sith Lords began squabbling over who would become Dark Lord of the Sith once Coruscant had fallen. For the next century, the new Sith were locked in a brutal civil war, losing much of their power in the process. That only changed in the final decade of the new Sith Wars, when Skere Khan united all the Sith under the banner of the Brotherhood of Darkness. The Brotherhood of Darkness was the closest the new Sith came to a unified Sith Empire. The Brotherhood established effective control over a wide swath of territory from its capital on Rune, and it sought to expand even further. However, it had no real civilian government to speak of, and it was essentially just a military machine, one that gathered scattered groups of ground soldiers and war fleets under the rule of the Sith Lords. The Brotherhood was essentially just a Sith order that some military groups had pledged allegiance to, and even as a Sith order, it broke a lot of norms. To get the claimants to the title of Dark Lord of the Sith to get along, Lord Khan decided to recognize everyone's claim to the title, proclaiming that all Dark Lords of the Sith would be equal in the Brotherhood of Darkness. There were 16 Dark Lords in all, with Lord Khan being a de facto first among equals. Together, they made up the Sith Council. Each Dark Lord controlled a faction of the Brotherhood, and below each of them were numerous Sith Lords, the best and brightest Force adepts in Khan's armies, who were trained at the Sith Academy on Korriban. Khan encouraged his Sith Lords to amass their own armies and conquer worlds in the name of the Brotherhood, but he forbade all of them from using the title of Darth, which he blamed for much of the Sith's disunity. Below the Sith Lords were several orders of lesser Sith, each trained at academies across the Brotherhood. The bulk of the Brotherhood's armies consisted of Sith acolytes trained on Dathomir or Iridonia, and Khan also maintained orders of Sith assassins and spies trained on Ryloth, Umbara, and Nar Shaddaa, as well as Sith warriors and marauders trained on Gentes, Gamor, and Honaga. All told, Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness functioned less like a Sith Empire and more like, as Darth Bane put it, a twisted perversion of the Jedi Order. This made it a greater threat to the Republic than the new Sith had ever been before, as it was more united and efficient. However, it also earned the Brotherhood the ire of Darth Bane, who detested how Khan betrayed the ideology of the old Sith and who engineered the Brotherhood's destruction so that he could build the Sith Order anew. So that was our look at the structures of the various Sith empires. But what do you think? Would you like to hear more about any of these 5 empires? Let us know your favorite one in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.